He raised his glass, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "Some people are born for greatness. Others just marry into it and hope nobody notices." Then he smiled at the table like he'd just told a joke. Nobody laughed. And 3 years later, I was the one signing the papers that took his name off the building he built his whole life around. Hey, I'm Denise. Before we get into this, if you've ever sat at a table where everyone was quietly deciding you didn't belong there, stay with me, because this one's for you. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. I grew up in Toledo, Ohio, raised by a single mom who worked 2 jobs and still made it to every one of my softball games. I put myself through state school on scholarships and loans, and by 29 I was running operations for a regional logistics company, the kind of job nobody writes movies about but that pays the bills and then some. I wasn't rich. I wasn't trying to be. I was proud of what I'd built with my own 2 hands. Then I met Theo Whitfield at a mutual friend's wedding in Charleston. He was easy to talk to, funny in a self-deprecating way that didn't match what I'd assumed about men who wore watches worth more than my car. We talked until the reception staff started stacking chairs around us. He called me the next morning, not 3 days later like he was playing some game. Just called, like a normal person who liked another normal person. It took me 4 months to find out his father was Walton Whitfield, founder and chairman of Whitfield Industrial, a manufacturing and logistics empire with contracts running through half the ports on the East Coast. Theo never brought it up. I found out from a magazine article a coworker showed me at lunch, half joking. When I finally met Walton, it was at the family's lake house in Michigan, over a long July weekend. He shook my hand like he was checking my grip strength, then spent the rest of the weekend talking around me instead of to me. At dinner the first night, he asked Theo what firm I worked for, like logistics companies only existed if they had firm in the name. When I answered for myself, he nodded slowly and changed the subject to a golf trip he was planning with men whose names I didn't recognize. I told myself it was nothing. Rich people are just different, I figured. Reserved. Careful. It took me another year to understand that Walton wasn't reserved with me. He was deciding, in real time, whether I was worth the effort of being polite to. Theo and I got engaged on a Tuesday in October, no ring shopping drama, no big production, just him getting down on one knee in our kitchen while soup burned on the stove behind him. We laughed so hard the smoke alarm went off. It's still the best proposal story I know, mostly because it was ours and nobody else's. The engagement dinner, though. That one belonged to Walton. He held it at the Whitfield family's private club in downtown Detroit, a building with oil paintings older than the state of Michigan and a dress code stricter than most weddings I'd been to. There were 40 people there. I knew 6 of them. Walton stood to give a toast, and I remember thinking, this is it, this is where he says something kind, something that makes the last 2 years of feeling invisible worth it. He raised his glass and said the line about being born for greatness versus marrying into it and hoping nobody notices. The room did that thing rooms do when everyone feels the temperature drop but pretends they don't. A few people laughed nervously. Theo's hand found mine under the table and squeezed hard, like he was trying to physically hold the moment together. I smiled. I clapped along with everyone else. And I made myself a private promise that night, sitting in the passenger seat of Theo's car with my heels off and my jaw tight, I was never going to let that man see me flinch again. The thing about Walton Whitfield is that he mistook my patience for weakness. He mistook the fact that I didn't fight back at that dinner for proof that I couldn't. That's the mistake almost every person like him makes. They think silence means surrender. Sometimes silence just means you're taking notes. Over the next year, the small cruelties kept coming. He introduced me at a company gala as Theo's companion to a room full of his executives, 6 months after our wedding. He'd talk shop at family dinners, real numbers, real decisions, and physically turn his body away from me if I tried to add anything, like I was a server refilling water glasses. Once, at a fundraiser, I overheard him tell his old business partner, "Theo's got a good heart." Sometimes a good heart makes bad decisions about who to trust with it. I didn't need his approval. I told myself that every single time. I had my career, I had Theo, I had a life I'd built brick by brick without a cent of Whitfield money. But there's a difference between not needing someone's approval and not being worn down by their contempt. Contempt is patient. It waits for you in every room you walk into. The breaking point came 8 months into our marriage, at what should have been the best dinner of my life. I'd spent 2 years leading the operational overhaul at my company, streamlining freight contracts across our whole Midwest network. When our biggest client renewed a 5-year deal specifically citing the changes I'd made, my company gave me a partnership stake and a bonus that put my net worth somewhere it had genuinely never been before. Not Whitfield money. But real, hard-earned, life-changing money. Theo insisted on celebrating with his parents. I should have said no. I said yes anyway, because some small, hopeful part of me thought maybe this would finally be the thing that made Walton see me differently. We met at a steakhouse downtown, the kind with a 2-month wait list and a wine list heavier than a phone book. Walton ordered for the table without asking anyone what they wanted, same as always. Halfway through the appetizers, Theo, glowing with pride, mentioned my promotion. Denise just made partner, he said. And the bonus alone is. Walton cut him off with a short laugh before Theo could even finish the number. Partner at a trucking company, he said, swirling his wine like the words themselves tasted flat. Well. Good for you. I felt my face go hot, but I kept my voice even. It's logistics, actually. And it's a 9-figure client relationship I built from nothing. Logistics, Walton repeated, like he was testing an unfamiliar word. Cute. He set his glass down harder than he needed to. Do you know what Whitfield Industrial moved through customs last quarter alone? Not revenue. Not some bonus check from a regional account. Volume that would make your entire company's yearly numbers look like a rounding error. I wasn't comparing, I said quietly. No, he said, leaning forward now, voice rising just enough that the next table glanced over. Of course you weren't. Because in your world, a bonus check feels like winning. In mine, it's Tuesday. He looked at Theo. I've been patient with this. I really have. But you married a woman who thinks project management is the same thing as building something. Then his eyes cut back to me, cold and final. You'll never be Whitfield. You're a nice detour, Denise. Nothing more. Theo finally found his voice. Dad, that's enough. Is it? Walton's tone sharpened. Because I've smiled through 2 years of pretending this was a real marriage instead of a phase my son needed to get out of his system. He turned to me fully now, and I will remember his exact words for the rest of my life. You're trash dressed up in a nice blazer, and the sooner my son wakes up to that, the better off this whole family will be. The table went dead silent. I heard my own heartbeat in my ears. I didn't cry. I didn't throw anything. I just looked at him and said, very calmly, thank you for the clarity, Walton. I've been wondering how you really felt for 2 years. He didn't expect that. For half a second, something flickered across his face, something close to surprise. Then he recovered, dropped $300 on the table, and told Theo to call him when he'd come to his senses. He left. Theo sat there, pale, apologizing over and over in the car, in the elevator, in our apartment, where I finally locked myself in the bathroom and let myself cry, quietly, so the neighbors wouldn't hear. He said his father had been drinking. He said he'd talked to him. He said a lot of things that night, but he didn't do the one thing I needed, which was stand up and defend me while it was actually happening. Sitting on that bathroom floor, I made a decision that had nothing to do with revenge, not yet. It was simpler than that. I decided I was done shrinking myself to make Walton Whitfield comfortable. If he wanted to see exactly what a nice detour was capable of, I was going to show him. I just didn't know yet how completely I would. If you're just joining me, in part 1, my father-in-law Walton Whitfield stood up at a steakhouse in downtown Detroit and called me trash in front of his own son. I'm Denise, and this is where I stop being the woman he humiliated and start being the reason his name comes off the building. Here's something nobody tells you about people like Walton: they think their power is permanent because nobody's ever tested it. I spent the next 3 months quietly testing it. I didn't tell Theo what I was doing. Not because I didn't trust him, but because I needed this to be mine, built without anyone's permission, the same way I'd built everything else in my life. I started with public filings. Whitfield Industrial was privately held, but they still had bond disclosures, Port Authority contracts, and a mountain of trade publication coverage. I read all of it. Then I started making calls. A former CFO, let go 18 months earlier under circumstances the trade press had politely called a difference in strategic vision, agreed to meet me for coffee in Ann Arbor. She didn't need much convincing. Walton runs that company like it's still 1995, she told me. He never modernized the freight tracking side, never invested in the automation his competitors already have. He's been propping up the numbers with legacy contracts that are set to expire over the next 2 years. When they go, there's a real problem. How real? She looked at me for a long moment. Real enough that the board's been quietly nervous for a year. Real enough that some of them would listen to the right person with the right plan. That was the opening. Whitfield Industrial wasn't publicly traded, but it had taken on minority institutional investors a decade earlier to fund an expansion, and those investors held real voting shares, shares that had been sitting mostly dormant because nobody had ever bothered courting them. Walton had spent so many years assuming loyalty was permanent that he'd never noticed how thin it had actually gotten. I used my partnership bonus, took a calculated loan against my equity stake at my own company, and put together $8 million in liquidity. It wasn't Whitfield money. It was mine, earned the slow, unglamorous way, and that made it matter more. I flew to Chicago to meet with a private investment group that specialized in exactly this kind of situation, family-run companies where the founder's grip had outlived the founder's judgment. The lead partner, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Renata, asked me the same question everyone eventually asks. Why this company specifically? There are easier targets. Over the next several months, we moved carefully. We bought out 2 smaller institutional holders who'd grown tired of Whitfield Industrial's stagnant returns. We met privately with 3 board members who'd been quietly frustrated for years but never had a reason, or an ally, to act on it. We didn't rush. Rushing gets noticed, and I needed this to be airtight before Walton ever knew it existed. By the time he found out, we controlled 38% of the voting shares. Combined with the disillusioned board members already leaning our way, it was enough. The board meeting was called for a Thursday morning in a glass-walled conference room on the 40th floor of the Whitfield Industrial headquarters, the same building Walton had named after himself 20 years earlier. I walked in wearing a charcoal suit I'd bought specifically for that day, hair pulled back, nothing on my hands but my wedding ring, which I still hadn't taken off, because whatever was happening to Walton, it had nothing to do with how I felt about his son. Walton looked up when I walked in and actually laughed. Denise. Did Theo forget his lunch? I sat down at the far end of the table without answering. Renata stood. Gentlemen, Ms. Whitfield is here representing a shareholder coalition that currently controls 38% of this company's voting shares, in coordination with board members present in this room. Walton's face didn't move for a second, like his brain refused to process the sentence. That's not possible. I would know. It's documented, Renata said, sliding a folder down the table. We're calling for an immediate vote on leadership restructuring. He turned to me, and for the first time in 3 years, I watched something other than contempt move across his face. It looked a lot like fear. You did this, he said quietly. You did this, I corrected. I just made sure you couldn't ignore it. He fought. Of course he fought. He threatened lawsuits that his own general counsel quietly told him wouldn't hold up. He accused me of manipulation, of using my marriage as a weapon, of things that weren't true and a few that stung anyway. But the votes were the votes. 14-6. Walton Whitfield was removed as chairman and CEO of the company that bore his name, effective immediately. I'll never forget the exact moment it landed for him. He stood up slowly, one hand braced on the table, and for the first time since I'd met him, he looked old. Not powerful. Old. This company is my legacy, he said, his voice cracking in a way I never thought I'd hear. It was, I said. Now it's going to be something better. Renata continued, laying out the transition plan, new leadership, modernized logistics infrastructure, the freight tracking overhaul that CFO had told me about months earlier, and a restructured board with actual accountability built in. Walton didn't say another word. He picked up his folder, looked at me one more time like he was trying to memorize the face of the woman who'd outmaneuvered him, and walked out. Theo found out an hour later, from a phone call, not from me. That's a conversation I'll regret the shape of for a long time, even if I don't regret the outcome. He came home that night quiet, hurt, asking why I hadn't told him. Because you'd have tried to talk me out of it, I said. Or worse, you'd have tried to fix it your father's way, with an apology dinner and a bottle of wine nobody actually wanted to drink. He didn't have a good answer for that. We separated 4 months later. Not out of anger, but out of honesty. When I needed him to stand up at that steakhouse and say something, anything, he'd gone quiet. And I realized I couldn't spend the rest of my life measuring how loud his silence might get the next time someone I loved decided I wasn't worth defending. Walton tried to rebuild his reputation in the press afterward. It didn't go the way he hoped. 2 former executives came forward independently with their own stories about his management style, his temper, the way he treated anyone he considered beneath him. The story wrote itself, and I didn't have to say a word. Whitfield Industrial is a different company now. New leadership modernized the operations within a year. Contracts that were set to lapse got renegotiated instead of quietly disappearing. Walton's name is still on some of the older paperwork, but it's off the building. They renamed it Meridian Logistics 18 months ago. I'm not going to sit here and tell you revenge fixed everything, because it didn't. The nights after the board vote were quiet in a way that didn't feel like victory, not right away. My marriage still ended. I still loved someone who couldn't find the courage to defend me when it counted, and no boardroom win changes that particular ache. But here's what I did learn, sitting in that glass-walled conference room, watching a man who'd spent 2 years calling me small finally understand exactly how wrong he'd been. People like Walton don't attack your worth because you don't have any. They attack it because some part of them already senses how much you do, and it terrifies them. He didn't hate me because I was trash. He hated me because I reminded him that respect isn't something you're born into. It's something you earn, brick by brick, contract by contract, year by year, and once you've built it yourself, nobody can hand it to you and nobody can take it away either. So if there's someone in your life right now who's made you feel like you don't belong at their table, remember this, you don't need their seat. Sometimes the best answer isn't proving you deserve a place at their table. It's building your own table, and letting them watch you do it. If this one hit home for you, let me know in the comments, and tell me where you're listening from. I read every single one. Thanks for sticking with me through both parts. This is Denise, and I'm done being underestimated too.